On May 13, 1985, the city of Philadelphia made a decision that would become one of the darkest chapters in American urban history. In a residential neighborhood with families living on every block, police dropped a military-grade bomb from a helicopter onto a rowhouse. The explosion started a fire that burned for over an hour while firefighters stood by, ordered not to intervene. When the smoke finally cleared, 61 homes had been destroyed, an entire city block reduced to ash and rubble. 11 people were dead, including 5 children. This wasn't a war zone in a foreign country. This was West Philadelphia. And the people who died weren't enemy combatants. They were American citizens. This is the story of the MOVE bombing, a tragedy that reveals uncomfortable truths about race, power, and how far authorities will go when they feel threatened. To understand what happened that day, we need to go back to the beginning and understand who MOVE was, what they believed, and why the city of Philadelphia saw them as such a threat that bombing American citizens seemed like a reasonable option. MOVE was founded in 1972 by a man named John Africa, born Vincent Liebhardt in West Philadelphia. John Africa was a charismatic leader who developed a philosophy that rejected modern technology and embraced what he called natural law. MOVE members followed a strict lifestyle. They were committed to animal rights and environmental causes decades before these movements went mainstream. They ate only raw foods, composted everything, and refused to use electricity or modern medicine. They took the surname Africa to honor what they saw as the birthplace of humanity. They wore their hair in long dreadlocks, which was uncommon and considered radical at the time. But MOVE wasn't just a back-to-nature commune. They were confrontational, deliberately provocative. They would use bullhorns to broadcast their political messages at all hours, sometimes through the night. They protested loudly outside courthouses, restaurants, and zoos. They stockpiled composting material that neighbors complained smelled terrible. They built fortified bunkers in their homes, and they armed themselves, believing they had the right to defend their community against what they saw as a corrupt and racist system. The city of Philadelphia, and particularly its police department, saw MOVE not as idealistic activists, but as dangerous radicals. Tensions escalated throughout the 1970s. MOVE members had multiple confrontations with police. They were arrested repeatedly. And in 1978, everything came to a head in a standoff at MOVE's headquarters on Osage Avenue that ended in a violent raid. A police officer was killed during the confrontation. 9 MOVE members were convicted of murder and sentenced to prison terms of 30 to 100 years, even though evidence about who actually fired the fatal shot was murky at best. The trials were controversial, with many believing the convictions were politically motivated. After the 1978 confrontation, the remaining MOVE members regrouped. By the early 1980s, they had established a new headquarters at 6221 Osage Avenue in the Cobbs Creek neighborhood of West Philadelphia. This was a working-class, predominantly black neighborhood of neat row houses where families had lived for generations. The house MOVE occupied belonged to Louise James, sister of a MOVE member, and once again, MOVE's presence created tension with neighbors. The complaints were constant. MOVE members used loudspeakers to broadcast their political messages and profanity-laced tirades against the police and city officials. The broadcasts started early in the morning and went late into the night. Neighbors said they couldn't sleep, couldn't have conversations in their own homes, couldn't live normal lives. Children in the house including MOVE members' kids, were rarely seen in school. The property was fortified with wooden boards and sandbags, and there were animals everywhere, dogs and cats that MOVE members rescued and kept, adding to the noise and smell. Neighbors complained to the city, to their council members, to anyone who would listen. They wanted help. They wanted the noise to stop. They wanted to live peacefully in their own homes. But the city's response was slow, and when it finally came, catastrophic. By early 1985, the city had decided that MOVE needed to be removed from Osage Avenue. Mayor Wilson Goode, Philadelphia's first black mayor, who had been elected in 1983 on a platform of reform and competence, authorized police to take action. The stated goal was simple: serve arrest warrants on 4 MOVE members for weapons violations and contempt of court, and evict them from the property. But the planning for this operation revealed how poorly the city understood what they were dealing with, or perhaps how little they cared. Police Commissioner Gregor Sambor and Fire Commissioner William Richmond developed a plan that was aggressive from the start. They knew from the 1978 confrontation that MOVE would resist. So they planned for a siege. They obtained arrest and search warrants. They prepared riot gear and water cannons. They evacuated the surrounding houses, telling neighbors this was a routine operation and they'd be back home soon. Those neighbors had no idea they would never live in those homes again. On the morning of May 13, 1985, hundreds of police officers surrounded the MOVE house. Sambor used a bullhorn to order the occupants to come out peacefully. Inside were 13 people, 6 adults, and 7 children, ranging in age from 7 to 13. MOVE responded that they weren't leaving. The standoff had begun. Police tried multiple tactics. They used bullhorns, attempting negotiation. They used water cannons, pumping thousands of gallons of water into the house through fire hoses. The water destroyed the interior, flooding rooms. But MOVE members stayed inside. Then police escalated. They began firing tear gas. Then they opened fire with automatic weapons. Over the course of the morning, police fired more than 10,000 rounds of ammunition into a residential house in an American city. Think about that number. 10,000 bullets fired into a house where children were sheltering. MOVE members fired back. There's no question they were armed and shooting. But the firepower was wildly unequal. This was a militarized police force with unlimited ammunition against a handful of people, including children, trapped in a rowhouse. By early afternoon, Police Commissioner Sambor and his team made a decision that still seems incomprehensible. They decided to use explosives to remove a fortified bunker on the roof of the MOVE house. The plan was to drop a bomb from a helicopter, blow a hole in the bunker, and then use water and tear gas to force everyone out. The bomb they chose was no small device. It was a satchel charge containing 1.5 pounds of C4 explosive and 1.5 pounds of Tovex, a water gel explosive used in mining and demolition. This was military-grade material designed to destroy fortified structures. Mayor Goode later claimed he authorized the use of explosives without knowing exactly what would be dropped. Commissioner Sambor claimed he had authority to use the device. What's clear is that multiple people in positions of power approved dropping a bomb on a residential neighborhood, and no one stopped to think about what could go wrong. At 5:27 p.m., a Pennsylvania State Police helicopter flew over Osage Avenue. A Philadelphia police officer dropped the bomb onto the roof of 6221 Osage Avenue. The explosion was massive. It blew a hole in the roof and ignited the fuel for a generator MOVE had stored on the rooftop. Immediately, fire began spreading through the house. This is where the decision-making becomes even more disturbing. Fire Commissioner Richmond and other officials made the call to let the fire burn. They wanted it to destroy the bunker, to make the house uninhabitable, to force MOVE out. Firefighters were on the scene with equipment ready, but they were ordered to stand down. They watched the flames grow, spreading from the roof into the house, and they did nothing. The fire spread quickly. Row houses are connected structures. They share walls. Fire in one house can easily jump to the next, and then the next. Within minutes, the fire had spread beyond the MOVE house. It was consuming the neighboring homes. The wind picked up, pushing flames down the block, and still, firefighters were not given the order to fight the fire aggressively. By the time officials realized the situation was out of control, it was too late. The fire had become an inferno. It raced through 61 homes on Osage Avenue and Pine Street. Families' entire lives, their possessions, their memories, their security went up in flames. The neighborhood burned for over an hour. When firefighters were finally allowed to fight the fire in earnest, the damage was catastrophic. An entire city block was destroyed. It looked like a war zone, like pictures from bombed-out cities in World War II. But the worst damage was human. Of the 13 people inside the MOVE house when the bomb dropped, only 2 survived. 11 people died in the fire. Their bodies burned beyond recognition in some cases. The dead included John Africa, the founder of MOVE. They included Rhonda Africa, who was 29, Raymond Africa, who was 28, Frank Africa, who was 25, Conrad Africa, who was 31, Teresa Africa, who was 28, and 5 children, Katricia Dotson, who was 14, Zanetta Africa, who was 13, Delisha Africa, who was 12, Netta Africa, who was 11, Tommaso Africa, who was 9. The 2 survivors were Ramona Africa, an adult member who escaped the burning house, severely burned, and Bertie Africa, a 13-year-old boy who fled through the flames. Ramona Africa later testified that MOVE members tried to escape. She said they attempted to leave through a back door, but police fired at them, forcing them back inside. The city disputed this, but Ramona's testimony raised horrifying questions. Were people trapped deliberately? Were they shot at when they tried to flee? The truth may never be fully known because most of the witnesses burned to death. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. Ramona Africa was arrested while she was still being treated for burns. She was later convicted of riot and conspiracy and sentenced to 7 years in prison. She'd served her time and has spent the decades since speaking about what happened, demanding justice for the people who died. Bertie Africa, whose birth name was Michael Moses Ward, was taken into foster care. He struggled for years with the trauma of what he experienced. In 2013, at the age of 41, he died of a heart attack. Many who knew him believed he never fully recovered from May 13, 1985. The city's response in the immediate aftermath was a masterclass in deflection and denial. Mayor Good appointed a commission to investigate what went wrong. The Philadelphia Special Investigation Commission, known as the MOVE Commission, spent months reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and examining the decisions that led to the bombing. Their final report, released in 1986, was damning. The commission found that the decision to drop the bomb was reckless, ill-conceived, and grossly negligent. They found that allowing the fire to burn was unconscionable. They found that city officials ignored warnings from experts who told them the bomb could cause exactly the disaster that occurred. The commission said the operation was poorly planned and catastrophically executed at every level. Mayor Good admitted he had made mistakes. He called the decision unconscionable, a word that suggests an action so wrong it defies moral justification. Police Commissioner Sambor and Fire Commissioner Richmond resigned. But here's the part that still infuriates survivors and activists. No one went to prison. No one faced criminal charges for dropping a bomb on American citizens. No one was held legally accountable for the deaths of 11 people, including 5 children. Some officials lost their jobs. The mayor was voted out in the next election, though he completed his term. But the legal system, the same system that had sentenced 9 MOVE members to decades in prison after the 1978 confrontation, decided that the officials who planned and executed the bombing didn't deserve criminal prosecution. The people who lost their homes, the 250 residents who were displaced when 61 houses burned down, faced years of bureaucratic nightmares trying to rebuild their lives. The city eventually settled lawsuits, paying out $12 million. Survivors of the fire received around $175,000 per family, which sounds substantial until you realize it had to cover replacing everything they owned, finding new housing, and starting over completely. The city promised to rebuild the block. What they delivered was shoddy construction. The new houses were built so poorly that within a few years they were already crumbling. Residents reported cracked foundations, leaking roofs, and structural problems. In 2020, 35 years after the bombing, the city finally agreed to spend millions more to repair the defective construction. The MOVE bombing raises questions that go far beyond one tragic day in Philadelphia. It forces us to ask, how does something like this happen in America? How do city officials decide that dropping a bomb on a residential neighborhood is an acceptable tactic? How does a plan that involves explosives, that results in a fire that destroys 61 homes, that kills 11 people, including 5 children, end with no criminal charges? Part of the answer is racism. MOVE was a black organization. The neighborhood was predominantly black. The victims were black. It's impossible to imagine this happening in a white, wealthy neighborhood. The idea that police would drop a bomb on a suburban street filled with white families is absurd. The response would have been immediate, the outrage uncontainable, the consequences severe. But in West Philadelphia, in a black neighborhood that had been complaining about MOVE for years, city officials made calculations about acceptable risk, acceptable casualties, acceptable collateral damage, and they decided black lives were expendable. Part of the answer is authoritarianism. When officials see themselves as facing an enemy rather than dealing with citizens, when they prioritize control and dominance over de-escalation and negotiation, catastrophic violence becomes possible. MOVE was absolutely difficult to deal with. Their confrontational tactics, their refusal to compromise, their fortification of their house, all of this created real problems. But the city's response wasn't proportional. It wasn't measured. It was an annihilation tactic applied to American citizens on American soil. Part of the answer is the militarization of police. By 1985, police departments across America were increasingly adopting military equipment, military tactics, and military mindsets. The drug war was escalating. The idea of police as soldiers fighting enemies rather than officers serving communities was taking hold. In Philadelphia, this mindset allowed officials to treat the MOVE house like an enemy bunker in a war zone, rather than a home with children inside. And part of the answer is institutional protection. The systems meant to hold officials accountable, the legal system, the political system, the media, often protect those in power rather than those harmed by power. District attorneys decide who gets charged with crimes. Grand juries decide who gets indicted. These systems are run by people who often share backgrounds, connections, and interests with the officials they're supposed to oversee. So Commissioner Sambor resigns. Fire Commissioner Richmond resigns. Mayor Good faces criticism but serves out his term. And everyone moves on except the people who lost their homes and the families who lost their children. The MOVE bombing didn't happen in a vacuum. It was part of a larger pattern of state violence against black radical organizations. The FBI's COINTELPRO operations targeted Black Panthers, activists, and anyone deemed a threat to the established order. Police departments bombed, raided, and assassinated members of groups they saw as dangerous. In Chicago in 1969, police killed Black Panther leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in a raid that was later revealed to be an assassination coordinated with the FBI. In Tulsa in 1921, white mobs backed by police destroyed the prosperous black neighborhood of Greenwood. Dropping incendiary devices from planes, the MOVE bombing fits into this history of viewing black resistance as an existential threat requiring overwhelming, often lethal force. But the MOVE bombing also stands alone in its brazenness. This wasn't a secret operation. It happened in broad daylight. News crews filmed it. The city admitted to doing it. Officials defended the decision initially. The sheer audacity of dropping a bomb on a residential neighborhood in an American city and then watching it burn is almost unprecedented. In the decades since, survivors have fought to keep the memory of May 13, 1985, alive. Ramona Africa has traveled the country speaking about what happened, demanding justice, insisting that people understand this wasn't a tragic accident, but a deliberate act of violence. She's been joined by family members of the victims, by neighbors who lost their homes, by activists who see the MOVE bombing as a symbol of how far authorities will go to silence dissent. In recent years, especially following the racial justice uprisings of 2020, the MOVE bombing has received renewed attention. Documentaries have been made, articles have been written. People who never heard of MOVE are learning about what happened. In 2020, it was revealed that the remains of victims, including children, had been kept by the city medical examiner and later given to an Ivy League professor for anthropological study. The remains were stored in a box at the Penn Museum for years. When this became public, the outrage was immense. Families hadn't been told. Proper burials hadn't happened. The bodies of children killed by the city's bomb were being used for academic research without consent. The city finally apologized and returned the remains for burial. This revelation highlighted how the violence of May 13, 1985, continued long after the fire was extinguished. The disrespect, the dehumanization, the refusal to treat black victims with dignity, all of it echoed through the decades. Today, Osage Avenue has been rebuilt, though the scars remain. The houses constructed in the years after the bombing are visible, different from the original architecture. Residents who moved into those homes live with the knowledge of what happened. Some weren't even born when the bomb dropped. Others remember vividly. Every year on May 13, there are memorials. Activists gather, names are read, candles are lit. People remember John Africa, Rhonda Africa, Raymond Africa, Frank Africa, Conrad Africa, Teresa Africa, Patricia Dotson, Zanetta Africa, Delisha Africa, Netta Africa, and Tommaso Africa. The MOVE bombing remains one of the most shocking acts of domestic state violence in modern American history. It's a story about how racism, authoritarianism, and institutional power can combine to produce tragedy. It's a story about how officials can make catastrophically bad decisions and face little to no legal consequences. It's a story about black radical politics, about communities fighting for dignity and autonomy, and about the brutal responses they sometimes face. But it's also a story about memory and resistance. The fact that we're still talking about May 13th, 1985, that survivors are still demanding justice, that new generations are learning what happened, all of this matters. History doesn't fade away because officials want it to. The truth has a way of persisting, of demanding to be told, of refusing to be forgotten. On May 13, 1985, the city of Philadelphia dropped a bomb on its own citizens. 11 people died. An entire neighborhood was destroyed, and no one went to prison. This is not ancient history. This happened within the lifetimes of many people alive today. The officials who made these decisions are still alive. The survivors are still fighting for justice, and the questions raised by that day about whose lives matter, about accountability, about how far authorities will go when they feel threatened, those questions are still urgent, still unanswered, still demanding our attention. The MOVE bombing is a reminder that American democracy, American justice, American values, all of these are fragile. They depend on people in power making moral choices, on systems working as they should, on society demanding accountability when things go wrong. In Philadelphia in 1985, all of those things failed, and the cost was measured in lives lost, in homes destroyed, in a community shattered. We owe it to the victims, to the survivors, and to ourselves to remember what happened and to demand that it never happens again. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.